The morning sun had barely touched the driveway when I slid my key into the ignition, and that's when I heard it. A raw, panic scream tore through the quiet street. "Ma'am, don't start that car. Your son-in-law was here last night." My heart seized. For a second, I couldn't breathe. My hands froze on the steering wheel as I turned toward the voice, a man in rags, sprinting barefoot, eyes wild with terror. "What did you say?" I whispered, but before he could answer, a thought hit me like lightning. David, my daughter's husband? The name tasted like betrayal. He stumbled closer, trembling. He touched the engine. "Please, don't start it." I saw what he did. Every muscle in my body locked. My husband's funeral had been 3 weeks ago. And now this. If this moment gripped you already, then stop scrolling. Like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because what I discovered next almost sent me to my grave. I stepped out of that car like I was stepping out of my own grave. My legs shook so violently I thought I might collapse right there on the concrete Julian had poured with his own hands 15 years ago. This trembling man, this homeless stranger who looked like he hadn't eaten in days, he was the only thing standing between me and whatever hell David had planned for me. "Your son-in-law came here last night with another man," he said, his voice cracking with exhaustion and terror. "They opened your hood." His hands wouldn't stop shaking as he pointed toward my car, the silver Honda Accord that Julian bought me for our 25th anniversary. The car that was supposed to be my sanctuary, my independence, my way to visit Julian's grave every morning. The stranger kept talking, his words tumbling out like a confession. I saw them place a small plastic pouch near the ignition. It smelled like gasoline. Sweet and sharp, like death waiting to happen. I wanted to tell him he was wrong. I wanted to laugh and say David could never do such a thing. But my hands were already moving toward the hood release, and when I lifted it, when I saw that wire cleanly cut and that hidden pouch glinting under the morning light like a promise of fire and pain, the world tilted sideways. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't some random act of violence. This was murder. Calculated, cold-blooded murder. And suddenly Julian's name was on my lips, a whisper, a prayer, a broken sob that came from somewhere so deep I didn't know I had that much pain left in me. The stranger's final words hit me like a physical blow. "Your husband once gave me food. He told me to protect you. Julian." Even in death, even from whatever place souls go when they leave this broken world, he was still trying to save me. I pressed every bill I had into that man's dirty hands, $43 and some change, and promised to return with more. He'd saved my life. My survival now carried divine meaning, and I understood with crystal clarity that I was still breathing for a reason. The emotions hit me in waves, disbelief first, then grief so sharp it felt like drowning, then fury so hot it burned away everything else. I sat on my front steps, staring at that car that should have been my tomb, and let myself remember. David had entered our family like a gift from heaven. The perfect son-in-law, charming, intelligent, respectful. Always saying, "You remind me of my mother, Mrs. Hughes. Julian is so lucky to have you." He had this way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the room, like your words mattered, like your presence was a blessing. Julian adored him. Absolutely adored him. I'd catch my husband looking at David with this expression of pure pride, like he'd gained the son he never had. Julian trusted him with business deals, family decisions, even the combination to our safe. "That boy has integrity," he'd say. He reminds me of myself at that age. But after Julian's death, everything felt wrong. Staged. David's tears at the funeral were perfect, not too much, not too little, just the right amount of grief for a beloved father-in-law. His eagerness to handle the paperwork and take care of everything so you don't have to worry seemed thoughtful at the time. Now it felt like a vulture circling carrion. I found myself muttering to the empty air, "You tried to burn me alive in the car my husband bought me. You tried to turn Julian's love into my funeral pyre." The words tasted like acid, but speaking them out loud made them real. Made the danger real. Made my survival real. Strength began replacing fear, rising up from someplace in my chest I'd forgotten existed. He thinks I'm old and alone and helpless. But he's wrong. I'm still breathing, and that's his first and last mistake. I arrived at Hartwell and Associates 15 minutes early, sitting in the parking lot trying to steady my hands. The law office where Julian and I had planned our future now felt like a courthouse where I'd learn how thoroughly I'd been betrayed. When I walked into that conference room, they were already there. My daughter Sarah and David, sitting side by side, holding hands, dressed in matching black like they were attending another funeral. Maybe they were. Maybe this was supposed to be mine. David's eyes met mine across the polished table, and for just a split second, before the mask slid back into place, I saw shock. Raw, undiluted shock. He hadn't expected to see me. He'd expected to be sitting in this room with Sarah, playing the grieving widower to the wife who died tragically in a car explosion, collecting sympathy and inheritance checks. But there I was, breathing and upright and staring at him with eyes that knew too much. "Mother," Sarah said softly, rising to embrace me. "You look pale. Are you feeling all right?" I almost laughed. Pale? I'd nearly been incinerated 3 hours ago. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just tired." The lawyer, Mr. Hartwell himself, a man Julian had known for decades, began reading the will with that careful, measured voice lawyers use when they're delivering news that will change lives. The main house would be mine, along with Julian's personal effects and his life insurance policy. Standard, expected fare. But then came the rest. 3 commercial properties in downtown, plus a large investment account that Julian had apparently established just 6 months ago, were assigned to Mr. David Sullivan in recognition of his invaluable assistance and as a token of paternal affection. My blood turned to ice water. Julian had never mentioned any of this. In 42 years of marriage, my husband had never made a major financial decision without discussing it with me first. Never. I studied my daughter's face and saw my own shock reflected there. She looked as stunned as I felt, her mouth slightly open, her eyes starting between David and the lawyer like she was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. David, meanwhile, sat perfectly still. No surprise, no gratitude, no emotion at all. Just calm acceptance, like he'd known exactly what was coming. "Julian trusted me like a son," he said quietly. "I promise to honor that trust." The words came out of my mouth before I could stop them. "You made sure he did." The room went silent. Hartwell cleared his throat uncomfortably. Sarah frowned. David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm sorry," David said, his voice carefully neutral. I stood up slowly, my hand trembling on the back of my chair. "You've taken enough. You won't take my life too." Walking through town became an exercise in public humiliation. I could feel the stares, hear the whispers that people thought were quiet enough to escape my notice. At Brennan's Market, where I'd shopped every week for 20 years, 2 women in the produce section fell silent when I approached. She lost everything to her son-in-law, one of them murmured to the other as I pretended to examine apples. "Harold says Julian left the boy nearly $500,000 in assets." Poor woman didn't see it coming. Poor woman. Like I was some doddering fool who'd been taken advantage of by a clever young man. Like I was too old and stupid to recognize manipulation when it was destroying my life. Their pity made me angrier than their judgment would have. I wanted to turn around and tell them exactly what their precious David had tried to do to me that morning. I wanted to describe the smell of gasoline and the sight of that cut wire and the feel of terror when you realize someone you trusted wants you dead. Instead, I bought my groceries in silence and drove home to the house that no longer felt safe. Late that night, I sat in Julian's study surrounded by his books and his papers and his photographs, whispering to the empty air, "Julian, guide me. Show me how to fight this. Show me how to make him pay for what he did to you. What he tried to do to me." The room felt different in the darkness. Heavier. Like Julian's presence was still there, still protecting, still watching over the woman he'd loved for 4 decades. I could almost hear his voice telling me to be strong, to be smart, to be the woman who'd built a life and a marriage and a family worth defending. I started going through Julian's files systematically, page by page, looking for something, anything, that would explain how David had wormed his way so deeply into our finances. What I found made my hands shake with rage. Bank transfers I'd never authorized. Dozens of them, each one signed by both Julian and David, each one moving money from our joint accounts into investment funds I'd never heard of. The transfers corresponded perfectly to dates when I'd been out of town. Visiting my sister in Phoenix, attending my college reunion, taking that art class in Santa Fe that Julian had encouraged me to pursue. Every time I'd left town, David had convinced my husband to sign papers. Every time I'd trusted them to handle things while I was away, they'd moved more of our money into accounts I couldn't access. The last transfer was dated 1 week after Julian's death. 1 week. While I was still crying myself to sleep every night, David had been in our bank moving money into his name. My pulse was racing so hard I thought I might faint when the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something made me answer. Mrs. Hughes? This is Dr. Morales. I was on your husband's medical team at St. Catherine's. We need to talk, privately. We met at a small cafe downtown, the kind of place where the coffee is strong and the conversations are quiet and no one pays attention to 2 people sitting in a corner booth talking in low voices. Dr. Morales looked like he hadn't slept in days. Dark circles under his eyes, hands that couldn't quite stay still, the careful expression of a man who was about to cross a line he'd never crossed before. I shouldn't be telling you this, he said without preamble. It could cost me my license. But I can't sleep, Mrs. Hughes. I can't stop thinking about your husband's test results. I leaned forward, my heart already racing. What about them? Julian's blood work showed extremely high potassium levels. Dangerously high. The kind of levels that stop hearts. He paused, studying my face. It didn't make sense. Your husband wasn't on any medications that would cause that. He didn't have any conditions that would explain it. But someone insisted we not investigate further. Someone. But I already knew. I already knew before he said the name. Your son-in-law. David arranged for immediate cremation. He refused to authorize an autopsy, said the family wanted privacy during their grief. Dr. Morales slid a folder across the table. These are copies of the lab results. Technically, I'm not supposed to have them. Technically, you're not supposed to see them. Tears fell onto the medical papers as I realized what I was looking at. My husband hadn't died of natural causes. He'd been murdered. Slowly, carefully, deliberately murdered by the young man he'd loved like a son. He killed the man who called him son, I whispered, gripping the edge of the table so hard my knuckles went white. And he tried to kill me to erase it. Dr. Morales nodded grimly. If you seek justice, use this evidence. But Mrs. Hughes, be careful. Very careful. Someone who's killed once won't hesitate to kill again. Justice is all I have left, I said, and meant every word. Victor Ramirez had been Julian's business partner before my husband retired, and now he ran a small private investigation firm downtown. Julian had always said Victor was the most thorough man he'd ever known, the kind of person who could find a needle in a haystack if he had reason to look. I sat in his cluttered office surrounded by filing cabinets and photographs and evidence boards and told him everything. The homeless man's warning. The bomb under my hood. The will reading. The doctor's revelation. All of it. Victor listened without interrupting, taking notes in handwriting so small I couldn't read it. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. David Sullivan, he said finally. Julian talked about him all the time. Called him the son he never had. Said he was going to make sure the boy was taken care of. He looked up from his notes. Julian never mentioned changing his will to you? Never. Not once. Then we have forgery. Add that to fraud, theft, and murder. Victor stood up, pacing to the window. I'll find what you can't see, Mrs. Hughes. The financial trail, the medical records, the timeline. Everything. Within 3 days, he'd uncovered more than I'd imagined possible. Forged documents that gave David power of attorney over Julian's medical decisions. Hidden accounts in offshore banks. Transfers of money that had been happening for months before Julian's death. But the most damning discovery was a series of meetings between David and James Hartwell, the same lawyer who'd read Julian's will. Meetings that had taken place while Julian was in the hospital, while he was dying, while I was holding his hand and praying for a miracle that would never come. They've been planning this for a long time, Victor said, spreading photographs across his desk. Your husband's death wasn't a sudden opportunity. It was the endgame. I stared at the pictures, David entering the law office, David leaving the bank, David meeting with men I didn't recognize in parking lots and restaurant booths. Then it's time to hunt the hunters. Victor shook his head. Not hunt, Mrs. Hughes. Trap. Victor installed 3 hidden cameras in my house while I was at the grocery store, buying ingredients for Julian's favorite dinner. A wall clock in the dining room. A decorative vase on the mantel. A ceiling vent that looked down on the entire main floor. If they confess to anything at all, we'll have it recorded, he explained. But you have to make them feel safe. Comfortable. Like you're surrendering. That evening, I called Sarah first. Sweetheart, I want you and David to come for dinner tomorrow night. I've been thinking about what happened at the lawyer's office, and I realize I was upset and not thinking clearly. Julian loved David like a son, and if he wanted to provide for him, then that's what Julian wanted. I want peace. I want our family to heal. Sarah's relief was audible over the phone. Oh, Mother, I'm so glad. David has been so worried about you. He feels terrible that you're upset. Then I called David directly. He was more cautious, his voice carefully neutral. Are you sure, Mrs. Hughes? I don't want to cause any more distress. David, you've been like a son to me too. Let's end this pain. Let's be a family again. He agreed, but I could hear the calculation in his voice. The careful consideration of whether this was safe, whether I was truly surrendering or planning something else. I spent that night cooking Julian's favorite meal, pot roast with potatoes and carrots, green beans with almonds, apple pie for dessert. Food that would make David comfortable, relaxed, confident that he'd won. Standing in front of my bathroom mirror that night, I practiced the words I'd need to say. The tone that would make him believe I was broken, defeated, ready to accept whatever scraps of my life he was willing to leave me. You killed the wrong woman, I whispered to my reflection, and for the first time in weeks, I smiled. They arrived at 6:30. Sarah carrying flowers from Julian's favorite florist, David with a bottle of wine that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week. He was dressed carefully, nice shirt, expensive watch, the look of a man who owned property and made important decisions. Conversation started carefully. Sarah talked about her job. David mentioned a business opportunity he was considering. I played my part perfectly, the grieving widow who was ready to accept her new reality, grateful for whatever family she had left. Julian always trusted you, David, I said softly, serving the pot roast onto plates Julian had bought for our 15th anniversary. He said you had a good heart, that you reminded him of himself when he was young. David smiled, but there was something predatory in it now. Something I'd never noticed before, or maybe something he'd never let me see. He was a father to me, Mrs. Hughes. More than my own father ever was. Julian saw potential in me when nobody else did. I nodded, my voice carefully gentle. And you repaid him how? With gratitude? With loyalty? I paused, letting the question hang in the air. Or with a bomb under the hood of my car. The room went completely silent. Sarah's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. David's face went very still, very careful. I'm sorry, what did you say? His voice was controlled, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. Oh, nothing important. I'm just thankful someone screamed before I started that engine this morning. Some homeless man who saw you and your friend working on my car last night. I took a sip of water, watching his face. Such a strange coincidence. David's mask slipped just slightly. That lunatic should have kept his mouth shut. The words hung in the air like a confession. Sarah dropped her fork with a clatter. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 67 years, but also feeling stronger than I had in months. You just confessed, David. He was on his feet in an instant, his hand reaching for something, a knife from the dinner table, Julian's carving knife that had cut 1,000 family dinners. But before he could reach me, before he could finish what he'd started in my driveway that morning, the front door burst open. Victor stepped in first, followed by Detective Morrison and 2 uniformed officers. David's face went through a series of expressions: shock, rage, calculation, and finally, something that might have been respect. "It's over," I whispered, and for the first time since Julian died, I meant it. The arrest was swift and efficient. David didn't resist. He was too smart for that, too aware that any sudden movement would only make things worse. But as they handcuffed him, as they read him his rights in my dining room where Julian and I had celebrated 42 anniversaries, he looked at me with something like admiration. "You're tougher than Julian said," he told me. "He always talked about protecting you, like you were fragile. But you're not fragile at all, are you?" I stared at this young man who'd killed my husband and tried to kill me, who'd stolen our money and forged our documents and planned our destruction with the same careful attention most people gave to planning vacations. "Julian protected me because that's what love looks like," I said. "But he also taught me to protect myself. You should have remembered that." Sarah sat in stunned silence as the police explained what they'd found. The evidence of financial fraud. The forged power of attorney documents. The medical records showing lethal levels of potassium in Julian's system. The recording of David's confession about the car bomb. "I don't understand," she kept saying. "I don't understand how this happened." But I understood. I understood that evil rarely announces itself with horns and a pitchfork. More often, it comes with charm and flowers and promises to take care of everything. It comes looking like the answer to your prayers until the moment it reveals itself to be your worst nightmare. The trial lasted 3 weeks. David's defense attorney tried to paint him as a grieving son-in-law who'd been driven to desperation by financial pressure. They claimed the potassium in Julian's system came from legitimate medical treatment. They suggested the car bomb was the work of random criminals, and David's confession was just the confused rambling of a man in shock. But the evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showed systematic theft over 18 months. Medical records proved the potassium levels were inconsistent with any legitimate treatment. The homeless man testified about seeing David and an accomplice working on my car. The recording spoke for itself. I testified for 2 days, telling the jury about the morning I almost died, about discovering the extent of the financial fraud, about learning my husband had been murdered. I told them about 42 years of marriage to a man who'd trusted the wrong person with his life. Julian Hughes was a good man, I said from the witness stand, looking directly at David. He opened his home and his heart to someone he believed was family. He was betrayed by someone he loved like a son. That betrayal killed him, and it almost killed me too. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned with guilty verdicts on all counts. First-degree murder, attempted murder, fraud, forgery, theft, I felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in months. Justice. Finally, justice. David was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The accomplice who'd helped with the car bomb was caught 3 days after the trial ended, found in a motel room in Nevada with $20,000 in cash and a fake passport. Most of the stolen money was recovered. The forged documents were voided. Julian's actual will, the one he'd written with me, the one that reflected our real wishes, was probated according to his true intentions. Sarah struggled with the reality of what her husband had done. She moved back in with me for several months, both of us trying to process how thoroughly we'd been deceived. How could we have lived with a murderer and never known? How could someone smile at our dinner table while planning our destruction? I loved him, she told me one evening as we sat on the porch where Julian used to read his evening paper. I really loved him, Mom. How did I not see what he was? Because love makes us vulnerable, I said. And people like David know how to exploit that vulnerability. It's not your fault, sweetheart. It's not Julian's fault. It's not my fault. Evil is a choice, and David made that choice. Months passed. Seasons changed. The house began to feel like home again instead of a crime scene. I started sleeping through the night without checking the locks 3 times. I could drive my car without thinking about bombs and cut wires and the smell of gasoline. The homeless man who'd saved my life, his name was Robert, and he'd been living on the streets for 2 years after losing his job and his apartment, became a regular visitor. I helped him find stable housing and a part-time job at the hardware store where Julian used to buy his weekend project supplies. Your husband was right about you, he told me one afternoon as we shared coffee in my kitchen. He said you were the strongest woman he'd ever known, but you didn't know it yet. He said someday you'd have to be strong enough for both of you. Julian. Even in death, even through tragedy, he was still taking care of me. Still making sure I had what I needed to survive. People ask me sometimes how I've moved forward. How I've learned to trust again after being so thoroughly betrayed. How I've found peace after discovering that someone I'd welcomed into my family had killed the man I loved. The answer is complicated and simple at the same time. I learned that strength isn't about never being afraid, it's about being afraid and acting anyway. I learned that justice doesn't always come quickly or easily, but it can come if you're willing to fight for it. I learned that love makes us vulnerable, but it also makes us powerful in ways we don't understand until we need that power. Most importantly, I learned that Julian's love didn't die with him. It lives on in the homeless man who risked everything to save my life. It lives on in the doctor who broke rules to give me the truth. It lives on in the investigator who helped me find justice. It lives on in the strength I found when I needed it most. David Sullivan took many things from me. He took my husband's life and my sense of safety and my faith in human goodness. But he didn't take everything. He didn't take my will to fight or my capacity for love or my determination to see justice done. He thought I was just an old woman, weak, confused, easy to manipulate and eliminate. But Julian knew better. Julian knew I was a survivor, even when I didn't know it myself. And in the end, that made all the difference. Today, I volunteer at a shelter for people experiencing homelessness. I teach financial literacy classes for seniors who want to protect themselves from fraud. I speak to women's groups about recognizing the warning signs of financial abuse. Julian's money, the money David tried to steal, has been used to help people who find themselves in situations like ours. People who've been betrayed by those they trusted. People who need someone to believe their story when everyone else thinks they're confused or paranoid or too old to know what's happening to them. I still miss Julian every day. I still talk to him sometimes, usually when I'm sitting in his chair reading his books or tending the garden he planted. I tell him about the people we've helped, about the cases we've solved, about the lives we've saved. Because that's what this has become, a mission. A purpose. A way to transform tragedy into meaning. David Sullivan thought he could destroy my life and walk away with everything Julian and I had built together. Instead, he gave me something I never knew I needed, the knowledge that I'm stronger than I ever imagined, and the opportunity to use that strength to help others. Sometimes the most terrible moments in our lives become the foundation for something beautiful. Sometimes the worst betrayal teaches us the most important truths about ourselves. Sometimes, when evil tries to snuff out the light, it only succeeds in making that light burn brighter. Julian would be proud, I think. Not just of the justice we found or the money we recovered, but of the woman I became in the aftermath of losing him. The woman who refused to be a victim. The woman who turned her pain into purpose. The woman who survived. As I sit here now telling this story, I want you to understand something crucial. This isn't just about one woman's fight for justice after her husband's murder. This is about recognizing that evil often comes disguised as love, that betrayal often wears the mask of family, that the people who hurt us most are usually the ones we trust completely. But it's also about something else. It's about the incredible strength that lives inside ordinary people when they're pushed beyond their limits. It's about the power of truth to overcome deception, no matter how elaborate or convincing that deception might be. David Sullivan was charming, intelligent, and completely ruthless. He planned his crimes carefully and executed them flawlessly. He almost succeeded in getting away with murder twice. But he made one crucial mistake. He underestimated the woman he was trying to destroy. He saw gray hair and assumed weakness. He saw grief and assumed helplessness. He saw an elderly widow and assumed she'd be easy prey. He was wrong about all of it. I was never helpless. I was never weak. I was temporarily broken by loss, but broken doesn't mean destroyed. Broken can be healed. Broken can become stronger than it was before. And love, real love, the kind Julian and I shared for 42 years, doesn't end with death. It transforms. It becomes strength when strength is needed. It becomes wisdom when wisdom is required. It becomes justice when justice is the only way forward. David Sullivan took my husband's life, but he couldn't take the love that sustained that life. He tried to take my future, but he couldn't touch the foundation of strength and purpose that love had built in me. In the end, that's what saved me. Not cleverness or luck or divine intervention, though I'm grateful for all of those things. What saved me was the simple, powerful truth that love is stronger than evil, light is stronger than darkness, and justice, real justice, is always worth fighting for. No matter how long it takes. No matter how difficult the battle. No matter how impossible the odds might seem. Julian Hughes was murdered by someone he loved and trusted. But his death was not meaningless, because it led to justice for him and salvation for me and protection for countless others who might have fallen victim to the same evil. Sometimes that's how the world works. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the source of the greatest good you'll ever do. Sometimes surviving is its own form of victory. And sometimes, just sometimes, the people we love never really leave us at all. They just find new ways to keep protecting us, keep guiding us, keep loving us from whatever place they've gone. I believe that with all my heart. I have to believe it. Because it's the only thing that makes sense of the senseless, finds meaning in the meaningless, creates hope from despair. Julian is gone, but his love remains. David is imprisoned, but the damage he did has been transformed into purpose. I am alone, but I am not defeated. I am a survivor. And that in itself is everything.